Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Ricardo Vaz, a journalist and political analyst based in Venezuela. He currently works as a writer and editor at Venezuela Analysis and also belongs to Venezuelan collectives Tatui TV and Utopics. He's originally from Mozambique and has lived in Venezuela since 2019. I welcome Ricardo Vaz to Savage Minds. I'm very happy to have you on the show, Ricardo. And I'd like to start off talking about the recent events of what legacy media is calling an invasion or is calling a arrest of. They're doing everything to avoid using the words kidnap. We've seen this before, both of us in the media and then the larger public, if they're old enough to remember how Noriega was effectively kidnapped. Could you talk about the legacy media and its coverage of what happened in the January kidnapping of Venezuelan sitting president and his wife? I am really alarmed by the coverage. I have yet to see a news outlet, aside from Al Jazeera, but even then Al Jazeera is not great on this. It's much better on the Middle East. But I've yet to see a legacy media outlet that is calling this kidnapping.
Yes, I mean, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. And I think that's a great place to start. The media, as you were saying, has gone out of its way to call it, there are many options, either a capture, seizure, or, Maduro being ousted from power, which is perhaps the biggest euphemism of them all. And I'd recommend people look up an article on an outlet that's called Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, where I believe it's Greg Shupak does an analysis on how the language is important, and this is the way the media has been legitimizing what is, by any measure you can think of, an absolutely illegal operation and the most blatant violation of international law. So this has been, but it doesn't start from scratch. I mean, it goes back years, and it's something that you've been aware of. I've also been aware and written about it. The gradual demonization of Venezuela and of Maduro in particular. This idea that he's authoritarian, autocratic, all this stuff, which kind of builds the argument for some kind of blatantly illegal action like this one. Going into another country and snatching their president. I can only imagine what the media would do, the Western media, if, I don't know, Russia went into Romania and kidnapped its sitting president, accusing him of, whatever imaginary crime it can come up with. So it just goes to show how the media is not some kind of passive observer. It's actually a very active player in US imperialism. And there's actually something even more sinister, which is reports that the New York Times and the Washington Post actually had information that this US military operation was going to happen, and they chose not to publish in order to, I'm paraphrasing, in order to not endanger US soldiers. So it goes to show what role the Western corporate media plays and how it's so deeply intertwined with US imperialism. And that's why, you saw some outrage in the US political circles about this operation, but it quickly faded away because of this media coverage. Even the political outrage from the Democrats, for example, didn't get very far. It didn't go as far as slapping Trump on the wrist. So that's basically what ended up legitimizing what is, by all accounts, an illegitimate action.
Yes, when I learned from Fair that the New York Times, the Washington Post knew about the invasion, given that they didn't report it, this causes serious questions of ethics for both of these outlets, because that means that they're operating as part of the Politburo. They're not acting as independent media representatives. They're actually part of the state apparatus, which is very worrisome because that has become its own problem in reporting of this and other media events, such as, let's just look at the Ukraine war for a second and how that's been reported, or Gaza. Both are full of examples of tendentious reporting by legacy media, where now you're seeing amongst a certain demographic, including of Americans, by the way, which I find hopeful, of people distrusting legacy media altogether, and they are more apt to trust what they see shared on TikTok or Twitter than they are coming out of the front pages of these outlets. One thing about the words that you use when you were just talking about the language of these outlets, seizure and capture, these are very particular words. Seizure is invariably in English used to talk about seizing drugs, right? Or seizing ships, seizing objects. And capture is used when criminals are captured. So immediately the language that these outlets chose to embrace was that of a very pro-US agenda point of view. I find this depressing because just 4 months prior, not even 3 months prior, you had a lot of the heads of state in front of the UN in mid-September allegedly decrying the genocide in Gaza. But when it came to addressing the kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores, they hemmed and hawed. They were like, well, it's not really a legitimate government, though we don't support this. You see, so they were speaking out of both sides of their mouths. Meanwhile, what happened in Venezuela was devastating. The media treats this as if it were a surgical operation where only 100 people were killed. Let's just forget about those people. Where were you when this occurred?
Yeah, so actually you made two very good points. I mean, one, I think the genocide in Gaza was really a watershed moment in terms of large masses of the public understanding that the media establishment is not to be trusted. And on the issue of language, just to complement something, it's actually evidence of how legacy media is so aligned with the official narrative from the State Department, because this is precisely how Marco Rubio and others tried to frame the operation, as if it was just law enforcement. And then you ask, how far does U.S. law enforcement stretch? Where does its jurisdiction end? I mean, I'm pretty sure it doesn't stretch into Venezuelan territory. But this issue of language goes back deeper. I was talking to you about how this narrative was built, but for example, when it came to sanctions, this economic terrorism that has been unleashed for at least a decade against Venezuela, it was the language also played a role in either downplaying or whitewashing, saying, the sanctions are meant to deprive Maduro of revenue, as if it's like his personal allowance that's being cut. So it always played this kind of pervasive and pernicious role. But back to the present, or the recent past, I was awake. I mean, this attack began at 2 a.m. and I usually work late, and I was about to turn in, and power went out, and immediately after I heard a very loud explosion. I had never been in any kind of war zone, so it wasn't anything like I had experienced before. It was certainly very scary and unsettling. And I wasn't especially close to the spots that were bombed. I think the closest might have been some 5 kilometers away. So it was really a night of deep tension and stress and anxiety, especially after we saw the videos of the helicopters. What are these special operations here for? Are they still in the country? Have they left? And then, of course, it all became clear around 5 a.m. when, I mean, first I thought it was fake, but then it was immediately confirmed that Maduro and Flores had been kidnapped. And then, several hours of uncertainty, thinking what happens next. I mean, is there going to be a collapse? Is there going to be chaos? But once Venezuelan people overcame their shock, the reaction was not to go out and riot or whatever. It was mostly a calm reaction that maintained certain stability. I think here grassroots organizations also played a role in terms of being immediately active. And then eventually Venezuelan institutions also, overcame the initial shock to react as they were supposed to. the Venezuelan constitution does not have a provision. They didn't see as far ahead. It doesn't have a provision for what happens when the president is kidnapped by a foreign empire, but it does have one for what they call temporary absence, and so that's where it falls. And in that case, the vice president takes over on a what's happened up until now. And the situation, I'm not sure it was reasonable to expect anything different because, I mean, it has been the case for several years now, but the situation mostly remained calm and stable. And I think that also helped. I mean, we're still processing. I mean, a lot of things have happened in the past 6 weeks, but the climate has been one of at least calm and stability all around the country, and especially here in Caracas.
And the way the media treated this was as if it was a really easy operation. Nobody was hurt. But when they say nobody was hurt, they're speaking of US troops. What happened to the people who were affected by this, who were killed, and their families? Because some of the people who were killed were, in fact, working for the Maduro government, and they were supporting, very likely, many people with that salary.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were saying, I think it's very disgusting that these 100 plus people who were killed just get brushed aside as some necessary collateral damage as part of a quote unquote law enforcement operation. So here I have to be a bit critical. I think the Venezuelan Armed Forces and the Ministry of Defense have not been up to task in terms of being accountable and actually giving a complete list of the people who were killed on January 3rd. We still don't know. We still don't have a definitive list. I mean, we have a list of about 80 people that includes 32 Cubans who were in Maduro's inner circle of security, and the others are Venezuelan soldiers, I believe also from Fuerte Tiuna, which is where the attacks were focused and where Maduro was kidnapped. But there are still more that we don't know. And particularly, we know that civilians were also killed. I mean, I don't think that there was a deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, but of course these weapons are not 100% accurate, and so there was a residential building. Sorry. There was a residential building in La Guaira that was on the coast that was hit, and one person died there. Also, a warehouse of medicines and some infrastructure here in a science research institute that were close to air defenses and radars. But again, there hasn't been like a report from the Venezuelan armed forces documenting everything that happened and also everything that didn't happen, because for a long time there was this perception that the Venezuelan air defenses would offer some kind of deterrence precisely against this kind of operation. And there was supposed to be multi-layers and multiple types of air defense and surface-to-air artillery. But when the time came, what we knew later was that, first of all, much of it was not deployed. It was not combat ready. Much of the personnel was on leave, still on holiday. So it looks like the upper echelons were not really expecting this. They did not believe that something like this was going to happen. And the rest was very easily dismantled by the US, whether by the initial electronic warfare that disabled radar, frequent bombing of air defenses. So again, this is something that I believe the Venezuelan Defense Ministry has to answer for, and because also preparing for the future and making sure that this doesn't happen again. But when it comes to the victims, you're absolutely correct. I mean, we shouldn't just brush them aside as a footnote. I mean, they were real people who gave their lives on the line of duty. The Venezuelan government posthumously condecorated the Venezuelan and the Cuban soldiers who fell. But other than that, there has been kind of a hermetism around the operation. I believe, I mean, I also to give them to cut them some slack, that there's also a lot of shock and trauma because the country was not really used to dealing with anything remotely like this.
What are the people's attitudes now? It's been well over a month, heading towards two, that Maduro has been gone. And obviously, you have the sitting president. But what are people's feelings about what's happened? Because there are so many things afoot here. Aside from my country, government kidnapped your leader, there were already political dilemmas that happen in every healthy country. You have debates, you have disagreements. What are people saying about what should happen with Maduro and the way that politics are going currently since his kidnapping?
Yeah, so let me split that into two parts. So I think on the one hand, the US has clearly taken advantage of what happened, just the level of shock to kind of impose let's say, a blitzkrieg agenda of changes and reforms. But, focusing on Maduro first. So the first week after Maduro's kidnapping, there were daily marches with thousands or even tens of thousands of people going out to condemn the attacks and demand the release of Maduro and Flores. And then, of course, as time goes on, it's hard to maintain this kind of daily mobilization. So they have been more sporadic since then. But within the Chavista grassroots, the basis, it's kind of a starting point. It all starts with demanding Maduro's release and return, with this idea, which is very amply documented, that the charges are phony, that there's nothing resembling any kind of legal case, and also that the US has no authority to try a foreign president in its own courts. That on the one hand. Also, from the Venezuelan opposition, let's say the opposition, I don't want to call them moderate necessarily because it's kind of a spectrum, but the opposition that participates in politics here, I mean, even they, as opposed as they were to Maduro, and as much as they would want someone else to be in the presidency, both the politicians and their supporters, they didn't want anything like this. I mean, it's not for the West to resolve whatever political issues exist here in the country. And then you have the extremist opposition, which is to a very large extent abroad, led by Maria Corina Machado. Maybe we'll talk a bit about her later on, who basically celebrated because they have I mean, for 25 years, they have had no clue on how to take power, and they have always been hoping that it's going to happen thanks to the US and that they are going to take a ride on an Apache helicopter to the presidential palace. So basically, they cheered, and they've been cheering everything that Trump has done since then. So that's on the Maduro front. And here on the domestic political front, I would say that to a very large extent, the government support has held steady, and it has either actively supported what Delcy Rodriguez and everybody else, the National Assembly and so on, supporting what they've been doing, or at least giving them the benefit of the doubt. But I mean, a lot has happened in just 6 weeks. I mean, we had a very significant overhaul of Venezuela's oil legislation, which I would argue is the most important piece of legislation in the country. And this was a reform that creates all sorts of benefits for private corporations in some kind of bid to attract foreign investment. I mean, this is also a consequence of sanctions being in place for so long. But I mean, just now, earlier this week on February 18th, the commander of the U.S. Southern Command was here in Caracas in an unannounced visit. And he came and he met with the acting president Delcy Rodriguez, Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello, and Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino. We don't know much about it, but the Venezuelan government issued a statement saying that they had agreed on some bilateral agenda to fight terrorism and drug trafficking. I mean, I'm not sure how you can cooperate with the US against drug trafficking and terrorism when the US is the source of drug trafficking and terrorism.
Exactly.
But also other changes. Yesterday, February 19th, the National Assembly approved an amnesty law, which again was discussed and approved in a very express fashion. So this again was one of the demands of the US, releasing I don't want to call them political prisoners because I believe that's a bit of an overstatement for many of them, but people who were arrested in context of political violence, in many cases after Chavista electoral victories or other attempts to overthrow the government. So this is going to be like a blanket pardon for all sorts of crimes dating back to 2002. And this is the kind of thing that makes the government supporters a bit uneasy. So the fact that these people who were not only trying to overthrow the government by unconstitutional means, but resorting to all sorts of violence and with direct U.S. support, the fact that they are now going to be pardoned in such an express fashion, this is the kind of thing that's already sparking debates from within. And then finally, I mean, we can go deeper into any of these topics if you want, but the U.S. has imposed some kind of colonial control over Venezuelan oil exports since January. So the way it's happening right now is that intermediary companies, these commodity traders, Vitol and Trafigura, they take the Venezuelan crude, and instead of actually paying for it, they deposit the proceeds in a US managed account in Qatar. And very soon that's going to be in an account of the US Treasury Department. And then the US decides how much of these revenues are going to be returned to the country, under what conditions. So they're only being returned to the banks. So the banks offer them in foreign exchange auctions to private sector importers. Basically, I mean, the US is in charge of what is the most important source of revenue for the country. And this, I mean, according to US officials and according to recent licenses from the Treasury Department, this seems to be the plan going forward, because even companies that are here like Chevron and Repsol, who are minority partners in projects, even they will be mandated. I mean, this is the license says, you can do this and that, provided that royalty payments, income tax, dividends, whatever, all of that gets deposited in an account run by the US Treasury. And then the US Treasury will decide, I mean, the Trump administration will decide if it's going to charge some kind of colonial tax, how much is going to return to the Venezuelan government, if it's going to impose, I mean, I'm sure it will impose some conditions before returning the funds. I mean, we also know that some of them will be used to import stuff from US manufacturers. So it's like forcing Venezuela to spend its own money in a certain way. So there has been some positives in terms of stability being maintained and the government maintaining its cohesion. But we have seen in 6 weeks, I mean, several blows against Venezuelan sovereignty. I guess that would be my summary.
From everything you've just described, it sounds like Venezuela's been put under a conservatorship, where Venezuela is Britney Spears and the U.S. is her father. It's colonialism 2.0. And the weird thing is that the way the U.S. media talks about people like Machado is that they are the real democratic future. They pose the future for Venezuela. Meanwhile, Delcy Rodriguez, she comes from a very interesting background. She herself has worked very hard within the oil industry. That said, to make it public, but at the same time, I'm thinking back to the 2000 law, the anti-blockade law. The purpose was officially presented as a tool to protect the public interest against foreign sanctions. But the reality of that law was that it allowed the government to sign confidential contracts with private investors and modify the ownership of state companies like PDVSA subsidiaries without public oversight or National Assembly approval. And the impact of that basically translated to an effective privatization of the state oil sector through the back door. So this could lure friendly capital from what was then China and Russia. However, Rodriguez is also very linked to keeping a certain face to socialism in the country. What are Venezuelans saying about her deals with Trump? Is she compromising the values that Maduro and the people voted for?
Let me just clarify a bit about the anti-blockade law, because sometimes it gets a bit oversimplified. So indeed, I mean, the anti-blockade law came during let's say, the harshest, the worst time during sanctions, and as you were saying, ostensibly a tool for the Venezuelan state to work around them. And you can understand that there's some need for confidentiality because the US was basically going after everything that moved, including oil tankers and all of that. But again, as you were saying, it also created these very shady agreements, the lack of transparency, but it did not change ownership. What it did create were mechanisms as sort of concessions. So the oil project would be leased to a private operator for some time and under conditions that were much more favorable than allowed under what was then the hydrocarbon law. So the anti-blockade law, in a way, violated the existing hydrocarbon law. And now what has happened with this reform is that what had been kind of an exception under the anti-blockade law will now become the norm. So now there are lots of mechanisms favoring the private sector and giving them more conditions to increase their profits. But again, it does not change ownership. There's still, I mean, this condition that the the state has to have majority stakes in all joint ventures is maintained, but there are different business models where basically all the control on operations and sales can be taken over by the private contractor. And so that's the kind of perspective that the Venezuelan government has been pushing. And this is kind of a long-term consequence of sanctions, but which now is engraved into the law. But as you were talking about Rodriguez, she does have an interesting background. She's not a typical Chavista leader like the others in the sense that she does not come from these grassroots struggles. She is the daughter of a very prominent Venezuelan communist and guerrilla fighter who was assassinated by the US-backed Fourth Republic, and this has obviously influenced her political ideals and so on. But she's someone who had very little involvement during the Chavez years, and then she went to study abroad. And then under Maduro, she kind of gradually rose through the ranks to vice president, and then taking over very important cabinet posts, first in terms of economy and finance, and then over the oil industry. So she's the one who has been dealing with potential investors from abroad and also with the business sector here in the country. She's very much an economic pragmatist. So she has this balancing act where she needs to, on the one hand, maintain the involvement of the Chavista grassroots, but also very much in the direction of offering benefits for investors and kind of normalization of capitalism and under the U.S. blockade and opening up the oil sector in particular to private investment. So it's not that this is foreign to Chavismo. Chavismo was always a very broad church, which included these pro-business sectors within. But I think it's fair to say that these pro-business sectors are the ones very much leading policy right now.
Despite the recent thaw in U.S. licenses, you have reported that oil production has actually receded. Why isn't the presence of U.S. private firms like Liberty Energy translating into higher output yet?
So the recent decrease in production was due to, and this is important to mention, since early December, the US imposed a naval blockade. So it was basically seizing tankers that were not, quote unquote, authorized. And this was also something that forced the hand of the government in terms of entering into this neo-colonial control over its oil exports. So that's what forced the kind of short-term decrease in production, because once the storage is full, you have to stop producing. Otherwise, there's nowhere for the crude to go. But that should be recovered very much in the short term. The question is whether this flexibilization and the increased potential for profits for foreign capital, whether this is going to translate into some kind of short-term increase in production. And there are various scenarios, some of them more optimistic and others less so. But the end question is, what's the trade-off? Because you might get more production, but under the reformed law, not to mention the U.S. imposed conditions, you get a smaller percentage of fiscal contributions from the oil sector. So is the end balance still positive for the Venezuelan government? I mean, it certainly is betting that it's going to be positive. Otherwise, there's really it's really a dead end. The Venezuelan government needs to maintain and improve material conditions in the country if it's going to have any kind of long-term political prospects. But it's going to be a challenge for sure. And the other thing that's lurking, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, there's a debt restructuring on the horizon. So because of sanctions and the economic crisis, Venezuela became unable to maintain its debt service, in some cases physically unable to make payments because it was blocked by financial sanctions. And so this debt has accrued interest in these years, and now it's, I don't know, 170 billion, something unthinkable, which at some point, the Trump administration is going to open the floodgates and allow for some kind of debt restructuring. And I think one of the reasons why the oil funds are being kept by the U.S. Treasury is that this way a portion of it can immediately be assigned for debt service under the Trump administration's controls. And again, this is going to make the economic balance for the Venezuelan government even more difficult.
And how do the U.S. licenses that block transactions with Russia, China, and Iran specifically impact Venezuela's existing joint ventures and then its long-term geopolitical alliances?
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. And a week ago or so, the Russian ambassador to Venezuela said this in an interview, that the U.S. is using unfair practices to drive away Russian companies and companies from other quote unquote undesired nations. Right now, it's not clear at all, because these Russian companies, and that especially Russian, that are minority partners in joint ventures, they also need to be paid. So there might be some arrangement where they are given a portion of the crude and they can transport it the way they want. But right now, I believe the U.S. is pressing to kind of force these other companies to sell their participation to U.S. counterparts. I think that's kind of the Trump administration's idea, to basically force, at gunpoint, U.S. corporations back into the Venezuelan oil sector, that then eventually, if there's a new government, if there's a step towards privatization and allowing majority stakeholding in joint ventures, that U.S. and Western corporations are in pole position to take advantage of that. But Venezuela strengthened this geopolitical diversification, let's call it, under sanctions. Iran came to Venezuela's rescue when there were fuel shortages. China became the main destination of Venezuelan crude, although that had to go through intermediaries and involve significant discounts. But all of that is a bit under question right now. And when it comes to China in particular, Venezuela was using part of the crude shipments to repay debts, as part of long-term oil for loan agreements. And so China has indirectly and very subtly, like Chinese diplomacy usually works, asked for assurances over its the credit that Venezuela still has to repay. So it seems like a lot has happened, but it's only been 6 weeks, and so we still have to see how the pieces end up falling, how strict the U.S. wants to be, whether it's going to continue enforcing this kind of physical blockade. I mean, it certainly looks so. Just last week, the U.S. forces seized tankers in the Indian Ocean. So that's how far they believe U.S. jurisdiction extends. And then how these geopolitical allies are going to react, and also whether the acting government of Delcy Rodriguez, whether it's going to actually make a push to demand that it be allowed to choose who it deals with, or whether it does not have the strength to challenge the U.S. Dictates at this point.
You've monitored the financial blockade closely. Is the U.S. freedom rhetoric simply a euphemism for the privatization of PDVSA assets by U.S. linked corporations?
I think that's the long-term goal. The reform legislation didn't go as far. I think that would be a big red line. But I think ultimately that's what the US is after. And actually, there was some analysis. Um, I can't remember from whom, but saying that the business is not necessarily extracting oil, but actually owning assets that can be used as collateral to generate credit. So that's kind of a more short-term windfall than physically extracting the oil. And also because right now oil prices are down, there seems to be enough supply. So in the case of Venezuela, where you have this very extra heavy crude in most of its oil fields, the incentives for investment are not as big as they used to be. And that's why even though Trump is courting oil executives and having these surreal meetings at the White House and selling Venezuela like it's some kind of auction, the oil executives are a bit reluctant to invest any kind of significant sums to the oil sector because the returns are not as promising right now. But I wouldn't just focus on the oil sector. I think the long-term goal as the US pushes and whether it's with more pressure on the Delcy Rodriguez government or eventually some other government that might come afterwards is, let's say, a reversion of Venezuela back into the Washington consensus. And so it's not just the oil sector. There's plenty of other things to be privatized, whether that's electricity, other services, ports, airports, kind of turning back all the advances in terms of sovereign economic policy from the Chavez and later Maduro governments. And just a few days ago, there was a report on Bloomberg on Adriana Cisneros. She's the heiress and now the boss of one of Venezuela's most known business conglomerates, and saying that they are raising funds and preparing to return to Venezuela under this assumption that there's going to be a wave of privatizations. So it's very clear that it's going to go in that direction. And actually, just tying back to something that I briefly mentioned, this idea of debt restructuring, it's very possible that whether it's to raise funds to repay debts or to settle debts directly, that this also involves privatization. So it's very much Ben Norton coined this sentence, I believe, neoliberalism at gunpoint. And it's been happening very fast, and we have to see, because at some point there's sure to be a reaction here in Venezuela.
What are Venezuelans saying about this? Because it wasn't so many years ago that the U.S. was decrying the quote unquote pirates of Somalia who were taking ships and using the proceeds to sort of Robin Hood in large part to back to the people of Somalia. This is a much more sinister version of that. Are Venezuelans calling this a kind of pirating of Venezuelan oil?
I mean, in private discussions, everyone I've talked to is absolutely outraged at not just the hijacking of the Venezuelan oil sector by the US, but also the official triumphalist discourse from Trump and Rubio, and recently we had Energy Secretary Chris Wright coming in and parading in oil fields and so on. But there is still an overriding priority, which is maintaining cohesion and stability, understanding that the logic is that these are kind of forced setbacks, and you have to take a few steps back, and then eventually you increase your room to maneuver, you regroup, and then start retaking the lost space. That's the rationale for some of the discourse that is trying to justify this very lightning reaccommodation with the US. I mean, just 2 months ago, the Venezuelan leaders were criticizing the US and blasting it for believing that it's the world's policeman and saying that it wanted to steal Venezuelan oil precisely. And now they are talking about a cooperation agenda on energy and even drug trafficking and terrorism. So it's been very much kind of a shock doctrine advance in that direction that takes a lot of processing and reorganizing. And also within this idea that Chavez actually emphasized a lot, the idea that you need to have unity in your political project. And that's what we have seen so far, at least within the most mobilized sectors of Chavismo. But eventually, there has to be a time to stop and take stock of what has happened and realize whether you're just going to go backwards indefinitely or whether at some point you have to resist, because you cannot just say, oh, the US is going to bomb us again. I mean, you just be trapped in that argument indefinitely and just end up justifying everything. But right now, I mean, it's only been 6 weeks and there's still a lot to process.
It's very disturbing to me, the disconnect between the way this is still represented in American and European media as opposed to the rest of the world. I try to read as many international papers as I can. I'm sure you do the same. And what are some of the things you've noticed in legacy media representation of even the post kidnapping era?
Yeah, so even for the legacy media, it's been kind of a challenge to adjust. So they're saying, oh, there are these openings, but it's still an authoritarian country. And in some cases, they try to, because the default setting is always to align with the official foreign policy discourse, but the official foreign policy discourse has also changed a lot. I mean, now you have Trump singing the praises of Delcy Rodriguez and saying she's doing a very good job. So the media is also trying to adjust to that. But I think, and maybe this will help us transition to the next topic. The legacy media is still holding on to this idea that there needs to be a quote unquote democratic transition. And for them, that's synonymous with Maria Corina Machado. And so the idea that Venezuela will only be palatable for the West, as if somehow that's the ultimate goal, once there is someone in power approved by the collective Western establishment. And in the case of Trump, Trump is much more focused on, first having something that he can present as a victory, and then just the money. And so he's not so tied down on this fallacious discourse of freedom and democracy. But for example, you had the Democrats, and I found this completely absurd. The Democrats saying that the kidnapping was not good, but this is also not good because we want Maria Corina Machado in power. So it's just kind of the schizophrenia inside the imperialist circles. So I think in time, basically the administration, and this is unusually rational for them, they understood that they could not just put their puppet in power. So it was perhaps the first reasonable admission of the strength of the Bolivarian process and the fact that it cannot just be wished away. You cannot just place someone else in power and expect everything to fall in place. But I think ultimately, and because they want to go even further than what's been going on right now, they are going to try and continue chipping away at the structure and the legitimacy of the Bolivarian project so that eventually they can force someone who is much more um, ideologically aligned with the US interests so that whoever that is can implement these neoliberal policies without having a gun to their head. I think that's the ultimate goal. The the US officials have talked about a three-phase plan where the third one is quote unquote transition. Energy Secretary Chris Wright also said there will be, as if he's in charge of the country, that there will be election in 2 years. We'll have to see. But Machado, and let me just give an intro and then I'll head back to you. Machado right now is a bit out of the equation because she's out of the country. Everything that's happened is in Trump's hands, and Trump is actually very happy with what's going on, and he's praising Rodriguez and the government. And so that might be the only silver lining or the biggest silver lining, the fact that Machado has been sidelined and she has lost a lot of oxygen in her project. So now she needs to find out how to actually return to the political setting, because she also doesn't want to be seen as undermining the Trump administration. So it's a delicate balance for her, which she's not very good at. I mean, she's always been a very forceful in saying that, we need a US invasion, we need a US intervention. So political finesse is really not her strength. So that's why she's in a bit of a silent retreat right now, figuring out what her next move is going to be.
Well, her last move was giving Trump her Nobel Peace Prize, which I found hysterical.
Yes, I mean, it was very, even for her, just so degrading. But it goes to show how there's really no political uh, project other than, going to the most powerful person you can find and hoping to ingratiate yourself with him. In this case, and it didn't work because Trump was still holding a grudge that, he wasn't given the Nobel Peace Prize. So he appreciates the bootlicking, but it's not going to work. I mean, it's not like Trump is going to place her in power because um, he had a nice visit, and actually the White House was very dismissive of her, saying that this was just a courtesy visit and it had no influence on policy. And so now she's trying to reach out to other sectors, reaching out to the Democrats, to obviously the Florida constituency, and trying to say, Venezuela remains a threat. I mean, there's still Iranian interests, but she's, as I was saying, she's kind of out of the loop right now.
Yeah, I don't think she read the room very well either, because if she wanted to befriend the Democrats, giving Trump her Nobel Peace Prize was not the way to do that.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot be friends with everyone at the same time.
Yeah, well, the Trump derangement syndrome this time around is also off the charts, I have to say. You've described the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize for Maria Corina Machado as war propaganda. I agree with you. When I read that this might happen, before it happened, I thought, how in the hell was this person shortlisted? How does this award facilitate the Iraq treatment and the manufacturing of consent for foreign intervention?
I think the Nobel Peace Prize actually played a role in legitimizing this US military buildup that you had in the second half of 2025, and which eventually led to the January 3 operation. And this betting website Polymarket, just on the eve of the Nobel Peace Prize decision, a friend of mine sent me a link, and Maria Corina Machado had like 70% of the odds. And we were thinking, these people are crazy. What are they thinking? And then it turned out that some people had inside information and actually made a killing on betting on Machado winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And the Nobel Committee was supposed to investigate, but we never heard anything more about it. So uh, I mean, it's not like the Nobel Peace Prize did not have these absurd laureates before, but I think this was very clear. This was someone who had never in her life put peace above her personal ambitions, and she was always going to get to power, whatever it took. Whatever violence was necessary, she was up for it. And in the case of Venezuela, she got the prize just as the US was bombing these small boats in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, and she was applauding them. So there was really nothing, there has never been anything peaceful about Maria Corina Machado, and it was very clearly, I think, on the one hand, it was a way for the Nobel Committee to not have to award it to Trump, but still legitimizing and giving more fuel to foreign policy. And as you were saying, manufacturing consent for the military operation, and the kind of actually the Iraq oil for food imposed agreement is a reasonable parallel with the disastrous consequences that it had. So that was it was clear at the time, and it's even clearer now that was the idea behind giving Machado the prize.
Machado dedicated her Nobel Peace Prize to Trump even before giving it to him. From your perspective, What does this and then the second gesture of giving it to him demonstrate, or what does it signal about the coordination between the Venezuelan opposition and the maximum pressure architects?
I think it says everything, but it's actually it goes back further because these Venezuelan elites, like Machado actually comes from two different oligarchic families that have had privileges and power dating back to the 19th century. So these elites actually grew in the shadow of the oil rent and with the very deep umbilical cord to Washington. So they've always seen themselves as the ideal US surrogates to run Venezuela. And then when Chavez came and took it away from them, it became an outrage, having this person who on top of everything, was from the army, from the interior of the country, and he wasn't white. So it just offended them so deeply, and they've never been able to overcome that. And then, of course, Maduro, from the barrios and the bus driver and trade union leader, it was an insult to them. And they've never been able, just like before Chavez, they never saw themselves running the country without this very deep dependency on U.S. capital. Right now, and after that, they never found a viable way to take power without U.S. support. And so Machado, dedicating her award to Trump and then symbolically giving it to him, just shows that whatever political project they have in mind is just telling the US leaders to fill in the blank. They don't have an idea, they'll just do whatever it takes, whatever role is assigned to them as US surrogates, they're willing to play. They have no interest in nationalism or sovereignty. They're just here to enrich themselves, enrich their friends, and push forward US interests because that's also ideological how they see themselves.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Yeah, and this fits into the larger history of what the U.S. does to Latin American countries. Regarding the government's denial of oil shipments to Israel, how central is the issue of anti-imperialist solidarity to the Venezuelan government's domestic legitimacy right now?
Yes, I think Israel is very much a red line for the Chavista bases. And there was a big stir before that. Nicolás Maduro Guerra, the son of Nicolás Maduro, who's a National Assembly deputy, he was giving some conference on, I think it was a gathering of jurists to create a commission to help with, Maduro's defense in court. And he had the microphone. I understand that sometimes improvising can go wrong, but he was trying to justify the diplomatic rapprochement with the US. And then he was saying, we should have diplomatic relations with everyone, and why not even with Israel? And this this actually did not go unnoticed, as it shouldn't. And people questioned it very strongly. He then kind of tried to deny it, not very successfully. But this is clearly, support for Palestine is a very important cause for the Chavista bases, and that's why this idea of Venezuelan oil reaching Israel was a big deal. But the Venezuelan government denied the headline because the headline was indeed false. It was a Bloomberg headline that said Venezuela ships oil to Israel, something to that effect. And this is false. But if the headline had been Israel receives Venezuelan oil, it would have been true, because since Venezuela lost control over its oil exports, and now you have these intermediaries, Vitol and Trafigura, taking the oil, then they resell it to whoever they choose. And here in this case, I think they resold it to, I think it was Repsol, that was taking part of it to one of its refineries and then selling the rest to this Israeli refinery in Haifa. So it is a fact that, unfortunately, Venezuelan oil is being used to, fuel, pun intended, fuel the Israeli genocide. And this is a consequence of, the US imposed control over the Venezuelan oil sector.
Oh, that's depressing. I wasn't aware of that bit. But the U.S. is starting to intercede everywhere. Since 3 January, we're seeing now that the U.S. is making moves on Cuba. Cuba is facing a humanitarian crisis. Garbage has been building up for many weeks. There are food and pharmaceutical issues. We're seeing that what was called a hybrid war in terms of what the U.S. did to your country using both sanctions and military force is being threatened not only towards Cuba, but also towards Mexico. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I mean, the situation in Cuba is very desperate right now. And I mean, on the one hand, it's a consequence of Venezuela no longer being able to ship oil to Cuba. It was for 20 years or 25 years the biggest supplier, and that played a big role in Cuban electricity and other aspects. And right now, it's not just what you mentioned. There's also public transportation grounding to a halt. I mean, they no longer have fuel for airplanes and so on. So it's really kind of a reloaded special period. I don't think, I mean, I hope I'm not wrong, but I don't think there is a military option on the cards against Cuba. I think it would have first a much bigger response from the Cuban forces and also a much bigger blowback at home. I think Cuba is perhaps paradoxically a more sensitive issue than Venezuela in US political circles. But perhaps one of the consequences that we've seen is just the lack of a unified regional response. And so the US says whoever sends oil to Cuba is going to face tariffs. And the response from the region, and particularly from Mexico, was actually to stop sending oil to Cuba. So there is no regional unity that can allow for some kind of joint response that will challenge the US and will challenge the US's designs to start Cuba. So now, I mean, you saw Mexico send other kinds of humanitarian aid, food and medicine, as you were saying. There's also a solidarity flotilla that's going to get to Cuba on March 21st. I mean, this is being organized by the Progressive International. And obviously all of that helps. There's also some kind of campaign to take solar panels to Cuba, but that will only solve the issue in the long run. So there is a kind of short-term desperation. And it has been disappointing that there isn't a bigger international response. But in a way, the Trump administration is emboldened to do all sorts of international law violations and these crimes against humanity, precisely because there is no pushback and there's only diplomatic statements. I think the Russians said that they were going to send oil, but we still don't know when that's going to happen. But it is kind of a direct evidence that without consequences, the US empire is only going to continue unleashing destruction wherever it can. And we're talking about Cuba, but another example is this massive military buildup outside Iran. And all the signs point towards war and attacks against Iran. And it seems like we are, sleepwalking into another major U.S. conflict.
Yes, that looks very dangerous. And I'm sorry to say that my fellow Americans, many, and I mean Democrat voters, do not see the problems in what our government is doing. There was a shift after 9/11. And it's fascinating how the politics of fear has been so successful because it's still going on. So you have quote unquote leftish, they're not really leftists, but leftish voters voting for Democrats. And these Democratic leaders, you saw it, you've read it, they are pushing all of these actions. It's very disappointing to me, both as an American but as a human, watching a country effectively bully the planet, and especially the countries in the global south. And it's also interesting, I'm sure you caught this, that Venezuela deserved to be treated in the way that the U.S. did. But the minute that the U.S. set its sights on Greenland, not so many days after, that's when European leaders started speaking out. Isn't that bizarre?
Yes, I think it's also it just shows, and this also ties to Rubio's recent speech in the Munich Security Conference. It shows how Western colonialism is very deeply intertwined with white supremacy. And so European leaders, they might be at best, and being very generous, they might be uneasy when these sorts of blatant imperial attacks happen against the global South, but they never expect it to happen to them. I mean, and you actually saw, I think it was a reaction from someone, some Danish official, reminding, we were alongside the US in Yugoslavia and the Iraq War, so how can they do this to us? It's only supposed to happen to others. But it just shows that the Trump administration, I think, in a way, we should be thankful that it no longer cares about appearances. And so it's just a naked exposition of who has power. And they don't have allies. They only have vassals. They only have subordinates. And that's how they treat Europe. And I think, in a way, it's very positive that the Europeans can come to this reckoning that they are not on an equal footing with the US. They are only there to support whatever the US is willing to do. I mean, they have paid the price for the Ukraine war. And now what are they going to do? Are they just going to go to double down on their quote unquote investment and just subordinate themselves even further? I think that's most likely what's going to happen. Or are they going to consider some kind of independent foreign policy? I think it's much less likely, but I'm not that informed about Venezuelan politics.
You've highlighted the irony of the U.S. setting Venezuela free while simultaneously controlling its oil proceeds via Qatari bank accounts. How can Caracas realistically claim a win-win scenario when they lack direct access to their own revenue?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, on the one hand, you have to understand that you cannot have an official. I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit here. The U.S., the Venezuelan government needs to present kind of a brave face and not admit defeat and claim that this was in the cards all along. We've always urged the U.S. to engage in dialogue, and now we can have an energy agenda that benefits both nations and both peoples. I think this might work on the surface, and it might kind of allow for a superficial explanation if we're being generous. But I think from a revolutionary perspective, you have to admit defeat because that's the only way that you can eventually overcome it. And so maybe the calculation is that at some point they're going to be able to gradually recover control. Maybe the hope, and I think this is more likely, the hope is that in the short term, the government believes it will be able to improve material conditions, and by doing so, it will gain more political room to maneuver inside the country, not necessarily in dealing with the US. But at the same time, I mean, many elements that had been key to Venezuela's political discourse and also international politics, the idea of the multipolar world, I mean, it has completely vanished from the official discourse. Anti-imperialism has also vanished from the discourse. Mentions of socialism, which had also become few and far between, are now completely vanished. And so you have this very pragmatic approach to the economy where you talk about the well-being of communities and turning the oil into hospitals and schools, which is a very I would say even misleading way of talking about it, because I mean the oil was already used for schools and hospitals before, but it shows that the actions are not being decided here, or at least to a large extent they're being decided abroad, and the Venezuelan government constantly has to play catch up and come up with a discourse to try and rationalize it and speak to its own basis. And so on the one hand, and this was, I mean, in Delcy Rodriguez gave an interview to NBC where she said, and rightfully so, that Maduro remains the legitimate president of the country and he's innocent or of whatever they're accusing him. But then 20 seconds later, she says that she has been talking to Trump and Rubio, and she expresses gratitude. And I mean, I'm directly quoting, she expresses gratitude for the respectful and courteous tone of the dialogue. But these are the same people who kidnapped Maduro. So it's a very difficult balancing act that they're trying right now. But we have to understand that, given just the magnitude and the shock right now, I think the priority is just to gain time and eventually regroup. In what direction they're going to regroup, that's the question.
Yeah, well, I have to wonder after reading these comments of Rodriguez, I thought, well, is she ass kissing to save another attack? Because that's possible. We're living in this reality and we must see it as such. Everyone is getting this on their telephones, just like they see the genocide in Gaza. The hypocrisy of what the U.S. preaches about democracy overseas, we see this now as complete bullshit, that the only countries that matter are the ones that do as we say. I think that's been clear. A cursory look over U.S. international relations over the past 170 years screams this. And you go through Latin America, country by country by country. I made a list for another interview I have. When I just started adding up all of the political meddlings, the military invasions, the sponsorship, indirect or directly, of coups, and other kinds of subversive tactics such as the Contras. Basically, the U.S. has been doing nasty actions in Latin America every 2 years over the past 200 years. Is the socialism project in Venezuela still alive? The fact that Cilia Flores and Nicolás Maduro are somewhere in Brooklyn, so they say, I hope they get a fair hearing. I really do. Given the recent military intervention, do you see any path for the communal power or grassroots movements to survive these pro-business reforms? Or is the Bolivarian project being sacrificed for not only economic stability, but to forestall a next U.S. invasion?
Yeah, so let me start by a point that I usually make. When we talk about why the US has been so fixated on Venezuela for the past 25, 26 years, and usually, the first answer is, the oil resources. Venezuela is sitting on top, the biggest oil deposits on the planet. But I think it's not just that. I mean, it's the fact that Venezuela was home to a revolutionary project that did indeed pose, to quote former President Barack Obama, an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. hegemony here in the hemisphere. And the fact that it was openly assumed as a socialist project, I mean, that must have set off alarm bells all over the Beltway. And also the fact that it pushed for regional integration with programs like Petrocaribe that also meant to help these small Caribbean nations develop their own countries as far as possible from US pressure. So all of that was obviously a very direct threat, and that's why the US now wants to discipline Venezuela, and this is all because it's also a lesson for everybody else and also, I mean, that's why the Cuban embargo is there. It's a lesson for what happens if you challenge the US interest in the region. But the communal project is, in my opinion, the biggest source of hope here in Venezuela. I think there is a very critical sector of the Venezuelan people that continues to embrace socialism as their political horizon. And in a way, I mean, it's also a difficult balance because they understand that these reforms, these top-down reforms in terms of being more pro-business, they are perhaps necessary to maintain the stability of the project, but then they are also fighting to create new social relations from the bottom up. And so there's this constant tension, and Chavez called them creative tensions. And in the past, you have seen the communal movements actually challenge the direction of the Bolivarian project and, force debates. And we haven't seen much of it in recent years. And at least my hope is that all these issues are going to come back on the table. And I mean, of course, there's the threat of a second wave of US bombing, and US officials have made this very clear. But you cannot just constantly live under this threat. I mean, at some point, you'll have to confront it. Hopefully, there's a better regional environment to confront it. But what I can safely say is, and this is from direct knowledge, is that the Venezuelan communards are not going to surrender. They're certainly not going to welcome any kind of return to capitalism and neoliberalism, and they're going to continue to fight and try to accumulate power to create a new kinds of economic relations, new kinds of political relations from the bottom up.
You've argued that Western media is using the Iraq treatment to justify potential military action. Well, they're doing this in a lot of areas now, we're seeing. They threatened Mexico. I was floored by that, just for supplying Cuba with petrol. What are the specific dubious claims currently being parroted that most concerns you regarding potential escalation?
So right now, I don't think escalation is imminent. I think Rubio himself said something like, we don't foresee it as being necessary, but we will use force to ensure maximum cooperation if necessary. I'm kind of paraphrasing. But there are many narratives going on. I mean, we had before this idea of, Venezuela being a source of drugs, and also I'm actually writing about this for FAIR, how some of the most outrageous claims that Trump made, the media actually did damage control. So Trump said Venezuela emptied its mental asylums into the US, and I'm not sure how it happened. If Maduro just took all the mental patients to the Mexico border and just catapulted them over the border. Nobody actually asked Trump how this came about. So that was the mental asylums, emptying their prisons, the drugs. But there are also other historically debunked narratives like the presence of Hamas and Hezbollah in Venezuela. And these are the historically local groups that emerged solely with the purpose of confronting Zionist occupation and expansion. Why would they be in Venezuela is anyone's guess, and it's actually a guess because there's never been any evidence. And so the media has always been able to either manufacture or allow US officials to manufacture these kinds of narratives when it's necessary to justify any kind of imperialist escalation. And we saw it with Cuba when Trump announced this oil embargo in late January. He said Cuba is a safe haven for Hamas and Hezbollah. And what would they be doing in Cuba in the first place? I mean, of course, we would like to be in Cuba, but it doesn't make any sense for them. So these narratives never get challenged. I mean, there's never any semblance of speaking truth to power. It's just a vehicle. Sometimes it's even a vehicle to expose these narratives ahead of time and see how they play in the public. I mean, we know historically how the CIA has infiltrated legacy media. And so in that sense, it's no surprise that there's kind of a tandem work between the foreign policy apparatus and the media establishment.
And what about the Chavista hardliners like Diosdado Cabello? Do folks like him view the cooperation with Trump by Delcy Rodriguez as a kind of betrayal of the Bolivarian revolution?
Not publicly, at least. I mean, there's been a lot of analysis of Diosdado's reaction to whenever he's in public. I think that's kind of exaggerated, but it seems right now that the priority is to maintain unity in the Bolivarian leadership and the Bolivarian project at large. And Diosdado has come out publicly, and I would extend this to the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, as well. They've both come out publicly backing Delcy Rodriguez. Diosdado perhaps a bit less enthusiastic about this idea of cooperation, whatever it means, with the US, but he hasn't come out in any way opposing it or criticizing it. And I think that's also part of the blackmail, because if you remember, in this absurd narco-terrorism indictment, Diosdado and Padrino also have bounties of, I think it's $25 and $15 million respectively. And so the US is also holding this over their heads and saying that, if you don't cooperate, then you might get the quote unquote the Maduro treatment. And I'm pretty sure that's being either explicitly or implicitly reminded to them in a way to ensure that because they're the ones who guarantee stability. Diosdado is the interior minister in charge of police, Padrino in charge of the armed forces, maintaining this kind of stability where you can have this accelerated push of pro-market and pro-US reforms with a view towards eventually replacing the government with more US-friendly more direct US puppets. And so in the case of Diosdado and Pedrino, I think they are in the same equation. They are trying to buy time. I'm sure they're constantly weighing their options, but understanding that the best bet is to maintain unity in the Bolivarian project.
I want to ask you about not only Delcy Rodriguez, but the manifestation of people like her, the bourgeoisie of sorts, people who come from the well-to-do families of Venezuela who have immigrated elsewhere. As you well know, those who fled Cuba after the overthrow of the dictator Batista in Cuba are called gusanos. And this was a term that they called themselves at first, but that term became turned on them because they became looked at. Gusano is the Spanish word for worm. It came to be codified later on by people who were part of the revolution as those without spines, those who have no form, no steadfastness, no conviction politically. And I'm wondering, is there a term like gusano for the Venezuelans who go abroad, who leave and spend all their time dissing on the Bolivarian revolution?
No, we just appropriated the gusano term and extended it to them.
Excellent. But this is the follow-up, because I meet a lot of these folks. When I was living in Germany, I met this lovely woman, her husband. We met on the playground. Our kids were playing together. And she, of course, was in exile. Her husband lost his air conditioning factory. This is all because of Chavismo. I tried to talk about the problems of class distinction and poverty in Venezuela prior to Chavismo, but that fell on deaf ears. So you have this kind of dilemma where the Western governments are very apt to hear the stories of people like this, just like they hear about the Shaw supporters and their children who have grown up in Washington, D.C. and Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. They hear the stories of the evil Iranian government, the evil Cuban government. But these are obviously political narratives that have been inherited generation after generation to legitimize the wealth of the 1%. What are Venezuelans saying about someone like Machado, who lives in Washington, D.C., and figures herself as Venezuela's next leader? Is there not a bit of hubris demonstrated by this woman that Venezuelans are sick?
Yes, absolutely. Although in Machado's case, she actually built her credibility because she didn't leave the country. She was here for a long time, and then she left precisely to go collect her quote unquote peace prize. But it also ties to our initial discussion about how the media creates these narratives, and I think one of the ways is precisely to overrepresent this very loud sector of Venezuelan migration. Same with Cuban migration, although Venezuelan migration is more recent. So there is and you have surely witnessed this idea that if you're not Venezuelan, then you cannot have an opinion about Venezuela, and then you should just submit to whatever the Venezuelan migrant believes. But there is a class phenomenon as well. So the migration that happens from the arrival of Chávez until, let's say, 2015 is very much a migration of well-to-do middle upper classes, either because they no longer wanted to be ruled by someone who embraced socialism, or because they had relatives abroad, or whatever. But this is very much a wealthy sector of the population that goes abroad. And then after 2015, when the sanctions start to bite, you see migration basically expand to the Venezuelan masses, and these horrible pictures of people having to exit on foot and so on. But the first group is very much louder and overrepresented compared to the second. And even, I mean, if you ask someone who had to leave the country, of course, their first instinct is going to be to blame the Venezuelan government. But they are, from working class families. None of them migrated because they had their coffee plant or air conditioning factory nationalized. And that's why, because the legacy media is so built into this capitalist consensus, the idea that Chavez would nationalize a company because, I don't know, they were violating labor laws, you never hear about that part. So it's just some kind of injustice that needs to be fixed, even if it has to be fixed by US bombing and killing Venezuelans, so long as in the end you get someone like Machado in power. But perhaps the greatest admission came from Rubio himself, because he was asked a few days after the January 3 attacks, why the US did not place Machado in power. And Rubio was frank. He said, we like the Venezuelan opposition. We've talked to them for a long time, but essentially they are all abroad. They do not have any access to the levers of power in Caracas. And so it would be completely unreasonable to expect them to take power at this point. But that hasn't stopped them from being platformed and overrepresented in the media.
I found the speech of Marco Rubio the other day astounding. I had to listen to it twice. And I'm seeing a lot of very aggressive rhetoric here as well. I'm thinking of von der Leyen and what's gone on within the EU, pushing for a war based on this fictional threat of Russia. Now, we've just talked about a lot of historical moments, but they all sort of tie together because we had the Red Scare in the 50s in the United States and certainly the Cold War, but this is a prolongation of the same rhetoric. There seems to be a fundamental fear of American leaders or people in politics in the States, and by default, I'd say Americans, because you've watched Fox. They think lowering the price of medicine is communism. It's ridiculous. The very same thing that they would want for their own family members, by the way. And there's a paradox, because we saw a lot of these same Fox News anchors start to speak about class interests, and I saw this clearly during lockdown. So this kind of right-left divide has already been fragmented. Marco Rubio, he's trying to fearmonger all the more, trying to equate, again, the older model of communist, the red threat to our country, our freedoms. I'm wondering if this kind of rehashing of old communist or anti-communist rhetoric is successful at all in the end, because the younger generations of Americans, and I include Republicans who are souring on America's relationship to Israel, and they're souring on the U.S. military buttressing of the genocide. So is this kind of old anti-Cold War rhetoric working? Or what was Rubio's mission in Germany, really?
Yes, I think Rubio is really a blast from the past in terms of, as you were saying, recycling the Cold War rhetoric. I think it's very clearly, and he has said it in more or less direct terms, a recognition of the decline of the U.S. empire and trying to fight back and stop it or reverse it to a greater extent. And you saw this when the Trump administration published its national security doctrine a few months ago, this idea that we have to take control of our hemisphere, we have to drive away rivals like China and Russia. And that's kind of what we were talking about, driving away Russian and Chinese companies from Venezuela. But I think the Cold War comparison is particularly relevant in this context of where Rubio was talking in Munich. And it's obviously difficult for European leaders who have this, I would say, unjustified exceptionalism. It's hard for them to get on board this very naked imperialism from Trump. But in contrast, this fear-mongering that was very much employed during the Cold War, the Red Scare and so on, was useful in trying to get Europeans in line. And although Rubio was kind of doing damage control, so playing, good cop to Trump's bad cop in saying that, we're all part of the same heritage and colonialism was great and America is a descendant of Europe and whatnot, trying to pull them into thinking that they are on the same team, but it's really the US calling the shots. So basically they need to ensure that Europe remains subordinated. And if necessary, it will be sacrificed in whatever conflicts the US engineers going forward. We saw it with Russia, how this idea of blocking energy imports from Russia decimated European industrial production. And so again, it's because of US influence over Europe, they are being asked to sacrifice themselves for, reversing the, I would say, inevitable decline of US imperialism.